Mitzvosecha. Issur Sinas Yisroel, Mitzvas Ahavas Yisroel, the prohibition of hating another Jew, the mitzvah to love another Jew. What have we learned so far? So we see what the Torah tells us about these two mitzvahs. From the verses that you shouldn't hate your brother in your heart, you should rebuke your fellow, you should not bear your son on his account. That's the original pasuk from the Torah. Sefer Chinuch explains what does this mean, that if a person hates someone else in their heart, it leads to all manner of ill behaviors toward them, and also ill behaviors in general, even if not stemming from hatred of the heart. There's other prohibitions that those violate, so just don't behave like that towards someone else. So just don't be like that. On the other side of it, we have the Mitzvas Ahavas Yisroel. You don't take revenge, don't bear a grudge. Kind of goes to what we said above. You should love your fellows yourself. I'm God. What does it mean to love someone else? Love them down to the soul level, and all kinds of good behavior will come from there. Just to understand, these are the two mitzvahs that we're talking about. This is what these two mitzvahs are about. This is what they cover. Not treating someone in a not good way, and actively loving somebody else at soul and heart level. Now that we know this, we can dive in. The story of the convert goes to Hillel, the potential convert, and he says, I'll convert on condition that you teach me the whole Torah 1 foot. Hillel says what's hateful to you, don't do somebody else. That's the whole Torah. Everything else is commentary. Go study it. We've explored two aspects of this. Number one, how can you say this is the entire Torah? The second one, which we're middle of, is why is it phrased in the negative of what's hateful to you? How is this the entire Torah? Not just that. Mitzvahs between me and somebody else, I can understand how integral it is. That's the entire society is based on that. But mitzvahs between me and God, what does that have to do with my treatment of somebody else? It doesn't affect him. So what's the deal? And not just that, to counter that, we start davening off with a declaration of Ahavas Yisroel. And Priyat Chaim says it's going to make your davening successful. So what's going on here? Davening between me and God. Why are we talking about Ahavas Yisroel here? It's saying it's integral davening. Not just that we see that Rizal would say confession. That Rizal's a great tzaddik. He doesn't have to say confession. He wasn't saying confession for himself. He's saying confession because to a certain extent, Jewish people are responsible for each other. How is that? Because we are all part of what's called the Neshama Klalis, starting from the first man, Adam Rishon, was a collective soul. So all the souls of all the peoples, specifically here we're talking about the Jewish people, we're all within that one soul. And then we all come from different limbs of the body. So the Jewish people in general are called one man, one entity. Souls come from different limbs of the body. The name of Adam is like Adam al-Elyon. It could be a name of praise that just like a son resembles the father, the Jewish people, God calls them my firstborn son. So we resemble God. How do we resemble God? When we are godlike in the sense of Adam al-Elyon, be like the one above, behave in the manner that we're supposed to behave in. Versus if you don't, then Adam is like Adama. The name of Adam has the gematria of 45. The gematria of 45 is the same gematria of God's name, the dimension of Ma, which what is so important about this dimension of Ma from the name of Avaya allows for the world that we know of. Versus the world that came before us, that's why when you look at the first pasuk of the Torah, it says Bereshis bara Elokim, and usually we translate it as in the beginning God created heaven and earth. So it's often also translated as in the beginning of God's creation of heaven and earth, to delineate that there's the creation as we know it, which is starts with the book of Bereshis, but then again there were worlds before this world. The world before our world, the world of Toh, that we call the world of chaos. In the beginning of the Torah, you see these verses, like in the beginning of God's creation of heaven and earth, at first everything was chaos, and the Spirit of God hovered over everything, and then God created, etc. We just go through the verses, but there's bigger Kabbalistic things going on there. What's this world of chaos? It's a world where the lights are so bright, these attributes, they're so bright, they can't speak to each other. They can't be contained, so they all exploded, etc. The world of Tikkun is a world where we could have a world of interrelation. That's the world that comes from Ma. So this correlation of Adam being 45 and Ma being 45, it's speaking to the fact that you could have separate things that also are interrelated to each other, that could still connect to each other. So that's the idea of the two separate paths becoming one path. We saw the entire description of Eliyahu Navi from Elijah the prophet describing how this system works. Well, the system that we know through the dimension of Ma, God has chosen to create this sort of body for himself. This body are these 10 attributes, which also when we are made in God's image because we have it also. God operates through this body. This body can wear different clothing, as in these attributes goes into different worlds, so it appears differently in each of them. Our world is very tznius world because it's very covered over. God is not compelled to operate like this. This is how he's chosen. This is how he's going to interface with the world. So even though we say that God operates through wisdom, we're not saying, oh, wisdom is God. Correlation of these terms, it doesn't make sense to try to fit on it into a descriptor. It's just God operates through this attribute of wisdom. So that's from Elijah the prophet. Then we saw the whole thing from Tanya about how the soul is in the brain and then it turns the whole body on at the same time, but it also gives the individual powers to each of the limbs, which goes back to the idea about how we could all come from a central whole and then still be separate entities, but that are still connected to each other. So the limbs of the body are still ultimately connected to each other because blood pumps through the whole body, same blood through the veins through the whole body. We saw the whole thing with the highly, the primordial kind of matter, and then from there everything came into being. Ultimately we get to the idea that we think we're separate, but we're actually not. So the same with the organs and limbs of the body, a hand is not a foot, and yet the hand and the foot are connected through the veins. So we think we're separate, but we're not. So what is the idea of Ahavas Yisroel? Ahavas Yisroel is accepting all parts of ourselves, including the interrelated aspects. What does it have to do with davening? Because davening is in the place of sacrifice. And what are the rules that we know of the sacrifice? The rules of a sacrifice is that the one offering the sacrifice, the Kohen, must be unblemished. There can't be certain defects. The sacrifice that's being brought, the animal that's being brought, must be perfect without certain defects. A person who rejects somebody else out of this baseless hatred, it's like they're creating a defect in themselves. And as we just said, davening, which is like sacrifice has to be perfect. A person who creates a defect within themselves, this cannot now be offered as a sacrifice. A person is going to stand before God with a deliberate defect that they have created by severing somebody else. How can you do that? This is not the way to bring a sacrifice. The whole Torah, boys, use using the example of davening that's contingent upon unity, upon Ahavas Yisroel, for this reason. We're going to keep expanding the idea about how Ahavas Yisroel is the underlying mitzvah of everything. But we see how even here, the mitzvahs between man and God are reliant on Ahavas Yisroel. Because even though this mitzvah is only between me and God, but God is going to see your soul and say, wait a second, something's missing here. There's a defect here. What was this? So versus something that you could just hammer out between you and God, that's a more specific thing. But something that rejecting a part of yourself, creating a defect within yourself, that's not only between you and God anymore. Then we got to the second part of it. Why did Hillel phrase it in this way? So we saw what the Maharsha says. Maybe he was just because it's the Aramaic, or the Maharsha says, yeah, we have to ask a question of why did he phrase it this way? It's not just because he's translating to the Aramaic from the Hebrew, because we know that there's a way that you could say V'afta l'recha kamocha, to love your fellows yourself in Aramaic. It didn't have to be like this. He gives other explanations for it, and then we go from there to the story from Tractate Shabbat, where Mar Baravashi says, we're talking about things with judgment, and he said, I can't judge a young Torah scholar. They're as precious to me as my own self, and a person doesn't see fault in his own self. And that brings us to, why did Hillel phrase it, what's hateful to you, don't do unto others? Because when we say that a person doesn't see fault in himself, it doesn't mean I don't recognize that I have weaknesses, or I have some issues, or I got some stuff going on. But it means that my own self-love is so strong that it covers over from it. I figured out how to sleep at night. I figured out how to deal with it. Not only that, but it makes me upset when somebody else calls it out. What do you do? Why are you verbalizing? Why are you calling me out on this stuff? It has nothing to do with whether or not that person is right in what they're saying. It has to do with the fact that they put it out in the open. So the same way that you don't like somebody else doing that, bringing all your faults out into the open, verbalizing them, articulating them, don't do that either. And not just that, but the same way that intellectually I know they're there, but I don't get into such an emotional state of extreme anger or anything over it, don't do that for somebody else. You can have an intellectual awareness, recognize that, oh, here there's an imperfection, and then move on from it without some great emotional reaction to it. Very simple example. You know someone who always runs late, so just pull up the time a little bit for them. Figure it out. You don't always have to get so upset, or just accept that this is them. They're a 5 minutes late kind of person. Certain people are exactly 5 minutes late. They're very punctual at being exactly 5 minutes late. That's how we have the verse also of Maamar lo yuchul Chabad Rebbe, the raging waters cannot extinguish love. That your love for someone should be so great that even these little faults, let the love overpower it. This brings us to what then is going to further explain how this underlies the entire Torah. Obviously, is the underlying theme of the entire Torah. This line that we say before davening of L'shem Yichud Kudsha Brichu Shchinte Leachta Shem Yudke Bevavke B'Chodesh Shalem B'Shem Kol Yisrael. For the sake of the union of the Holy One. We say it before davening, but our intent in everything that we're doing is that we are uniting this aspect of God that's called Kudsha Brichu or Kadosh Baruch Hu, the separate one, the Holy One, blessed be He, and Shechina Malchus, which is the source of the Jewish people. Shechina is in the part that dwells here, and Kadosh Baruch Hu is the part that's higher than that. So it's the Zah and Malchus, the 6 attributes with the final attribute of Malchus. All Torah is supposed to facilitate an alignment, a connection between these two aspects, that which is above the world and that which dwells in the world. So because one aspect is God who is separate from the world, and the other aspect is this Malchus, which is where the source of our souls is, this is how we could have effect on this. So we could affect the alignment process. God forbid it, if we're rejecting others for baseless hatred, the disunity that we have creates a disunity above. As in, it doesn't allow for the full proper alignment above, as it should be, which is what the entire Torah is all about, creating this alignment. The same way a person sees no fault in themselves because their great self-love overpowers, when we have unity, as in you're accepting all the parts of yourself, including the interrelated parts of yourself. So the same way that you have self-love that covers over for your faults, that self-love is going to cover over for somebody else's flaws, etc. When we do that down here, that creates a correlating response above. All the alignments, as in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One blessed be, that which is separate, aligns with the source of all the Jewish souls, as in creating a unity between us and God. Our self-love overwhelms, so we see no fault in anybody else. That creates a mirror effect that the self-love of this man that we have completed also will see no fault within himself, because God, of course, is perfect. So if there's fault there, it's us bringing it in. But we're like, hey, look, we are all just one entity, and our self-love is covered over for everything. That creates a mirroring effect. That God is like, yes, we are also perfect. I can overlook these small little flaws. This is what we ended up with last time. It was kind of in the middle of something. We were talking about how God beholds no sin, that we saw the verse from Parshas Balak, Lo bit avim b'Yaakov, lo amal b'Yisrael. He sees no sin in Yaakov and sees no wrongdoing in Israel. Doesn't mean that he doesn't see any fault. It means that he overlooks it. Because God knows everything, including trivial conversation. Which brings us to this, which it says from Vayikra Rabbah. It's a little bit of a tangent, but this is what it has to do with the fact that the Maamar kind of threw out this line that God knows everything, so here we go. There's a whole story about at the end of King Saul's, Shaul HaMelech, toward the end of his reign. Shmuel HaNavi, Samuel the prophet, had passed away. The whole story of Goliath already happened. It was a very short time. He didn't reign for very long. King David already married Michal, his daughter. The whole situation where he decides he doesn't like him anymore, and he was accidentally, quote unquote, throwing a spear at him and all that kind of stuff. So King David he's not king yet. He was anointed, but he has to escape. Michal helps him escape. His brother-in-law, best friend, Yonasan, helps him escape. And he's on the run from King Saul for a long while. There was going to be a battle. King Saul had to go and be part of the battle. He was going to go, his sons are going to go, etc. But before he went, he's not supposed to do this. He ended up going to a necromancer to call up. He wanted the dead to be raised up. He wanted Samuel the prophet, Shmuel, to be raised up. First, he's like, I need a necromancer. And they're like, King Saul, you wiped out all necromancers because that's what the Torah says. You have to get rid of all these people. So how are we supposed to find this for you? Eventually, they find someone, and she does whatever the process is, and she calls up Shmuel and Samuel the prophet, who comes up, and he's obviously very very upset with King Saul of, what have you done here? What is this whole situation? And basically they end up conversing, and the bottom line is you got to go to this battle, but you and your sons are going to die tomorrow. To his credit, King Saul does not flinch. He does go to battle. That is when he's killed. Him and his son, Jonathan die in the war. This is the only time I did not put in the entire text. It's the whole long story, and I did not put it in. Because there's the whole thing about how he gets called up, and then usually they come up upside down, but he comes up standing upright because he's a prophet. Yeah, it's not some zombie thing, because you talk about holy people, the fact that we live a physical body is just one stage of the soul's existence. We are now in the physical stage of existence, because your soul's eternal. A body is just a physical housing for the soul during a certain amount of time, however long your life is. The point of bringing this whole story is actually not the story. The point of bringing the story is that here we learn this idea that God knows everything, even trivial conversation. That's why there's a bunch of ellipses within this text. Shaul Melech removed all the conjurers and necromancers from the land, and he says, seek for me a woman who is a conjurer. So they give the example of like a king has all the horses killed, and he's like, get me a horse, and they're like, king, he just said get rid of all of them. Shaul, he did what he was supposed to do by getting rid of all these black magic peoples, etc., etc. They find a woman who is a conjurer. That's why ellipses, 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 and now we get to, she calls up Shmuel Hanavi, Samuel the prophet. So Shmuel Hanavi says to Shaul, why have you roused me to raise me? Rabbi Yehuda Nasi would interpret verses, and when he would reach this verse, he would weep, for behold, the former of mountains and creator of wind, who tells man what his conversation is. So he brings this correlation. What is who tells man what his conversation is? Rav Huna said in the name of Rabbi Yabitz, former of mountains and creator of wind, because Hashem is the former of mountains and creator of wind, which represents substance and spirit. He's able to tell man what his conversation is, as man's conversation is formed through a combination of man's substance, i.e. his physical body and his spirit. That's from the Eitz Yosef, explaining this verse. Rav Huna in the name of Rabbi Yabitz said, another, emptiness, darkness, and blackness. Some suggest that the text should read, he renders dawn, darkness, Apha, emptiness, darkness, and blackness. According to this version, Rabbi Yabitz cites the continuation of the verse in Amos and explains that the unusual term Apha means emptiness, darkness, and blackness. They're going off on a whole thing now of all these different verses, according to what's said here. Now, look, this verse, this verse, this verse. Okay. The context remains the previous phrase in the verse that Hashem tells man what his conversation is. Even matters that have no substance, even insignificant conversation that a man converses with his wife, are written in a person's ledger and are read to him at the time of his death. Who writes them? He renders dawn darkness. Hashem, Lord of hosts, is his name. All this is to say, getting back to the original point about how God knows everything, and even things that seem so trivial and nothingness, that God knows all of it and pays attention to all of it. Going back for a second, rather, as in this is not following the original thought that we said, that just as physical man doesn't see his own faults, when the Jewish people are united with the sublime man, their faults become, quote unquote, his, and one doesn't notice his faults. He beholds no sin and sees no wrongdoing, doesn't mean the faults are concealed from him, for everything is revealed and known to him, even trivial conversation, ... Rather, right? Doesn't mean that he doesn't see, everything is known to him, even trivial conversation, as we just saw from the story here. This is from Eov, Job, for he knows deceitful people, he sees iniquity, but takes no notice of it. So it's the idea of having the intellectual awareness, but not letting it lead to an emotional response. So, although he, as in Hashem, although he knows man's faults, influences is drawn down from that knowledge to awaken the attribute of Gevurah, severity and judgment, for his love covers them. As in, I know you've done wrong for this, there should be judgment and punishment for it, but because I love you so much, we have this great unity love situation, I will not allow that something should follow from this, that there should not be judgment from this, because the love is going to be stronger than what the judgment should be. This is from Eov, for a man whose way is hidden, and before whom Elka, as in his God, erected a barrier. As in, when it says a barrier, that God is going to use the love as a barrier to block that the Gevurah should not come into effect. So we have the name of Elokah, which is Aleph Lamed, and then a Vav and a Hey. So Aleph Lamed is the name of Kel, it's the name of God, it's the name of kindness. Chesed Elyon, it's sublime kindness, is in the higher level of kindness. Kel relates to kindness. We know God's names. Havaya is infinity, it's mercy. Elokim, we know his nature and judgment, etc. The verse uses the name of Elokah, we're dividing the word. Aleph Lamed, the name of Kel, is the name of kindness, and Vav and Hey. Kel relates to kindness. Vav Hey of Havaya refer to Zer Ampin and Malchus. Remember in the charts that you have God's name, the Yud and the Hey, and then the Vav and the Hey. The Yud is Chachma and the Hey is Bina, and then Vav are the 6 emotive attributes because they draw down like a straight line, and then Hey, and Malchus kingship, because that goes and creates, like the letter spreads out. Then it says that Elkah, as in his God, creates a barrier over here. Why are we using this name? Because it's a name of kindness. Vav and Hey, which is these 2 other parts. Zah, the 6 emotive attributes, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hey as Malchus is in the source of the Jewish souls. We're creating a barrier. So thus Hashem's kindness encompasses these lower levels. God's love, kindness and love are using interchangeably. God's love is going to cover over all of this. This place where all the unity is going on, that God's love is going to flow over encompass all of it so that this attribute of Gevurah does not come down and enact judgment on the faults that are there. This kindness, the kindness of this name of God, the sublime, the higher level of kindness, this kindness that erected a barrier so that judgment should not come down to this level where all the unity is taking place. We don't want judgment to go on there. What does it mean is that it's noticing the flaws, but there's not going to be a response to it because the love is going to be too great. Why? Because kindness erects the barrier there. This kindness envelops the Jewish person, acting as garment and seal for the soul, as in protection so their flaws aren't acknowledged. We just explained. When we have the unity, the love overrides everything else, so even where there should be judgment, there is not judgment because love overpowers it. The same way a person sees no faults in themselves and everything we explained along those lines. If, however, chas v'shalom, God forbid, there is separation among the people, then, as with any kohen with a mum shall not draw close, as in the verse of a kohen is not allowed to have a mum, a blemish, a defect, is not allowed to come to bring the sacrifices. The existence of a defect also causes separation above between Hashem and the Shekhinah, the source of Jewish people. Then sublime man sees flaws, that person's in particular, for he brought disunity, chas v'shalom. When we talk about what's hateful to you, don't do to somebody else, it's not just don't call out somebody's flaws. It builds into the whole idea of the same way that your own self-love overpowers the flaws, you figure it out with yourself. So the same way, that's what you're supposed to do to somebody else. Not just because, oh, I don't like this, but because of the unity effects that come from it, that when we have this sort of unity amongst ourselves, that creates the perfect alignment, unity with us and God, and thereby God doesn't see our defects. Versus somebody who rejects somebody else out of this baseless hatred, and they're rejecting somebody else, that person deliberately creates a flaw, they deliberately create a defect, and someone who has a defect is not allowed to come to bring a sacrifice to God. The sacrifice itself can't have a defect either, so it's preventing the unity from happening. And do you think God is not going to notice who caused that? It's not just the person who created the defect, it's that the person then also draws attention to himself as the one who created the defect. And then he gets put under the microscope. So let's not do that. By the way, you also have an idea that God says, we might have mentioned that God does not dwell in a place of strife. God dwells where there is unity, because unity is the oneness of all of this. Hashem's brachos depend on the unity of the Jewish people. We have to say it in davening. Barcheinu Avinu Kulanu Ke'echad. Bless us, our Father, all of us as one. As in, us a united entity, thereby God's blessings especially could rest upon us. That brings us also to the verse, which we actually saw in the last Maamar of Tamim Tia Im Havaya Elokecha. You should be perfect with Havaya Elokecha. Last time we were saying it in the terminology of how we have to have the perfect alignment of the ecosystem so that everything can flow the way it's supposed to. And here we're saying it about being perfect with God in the sense of don't create any defects. Similar vein over here that we have the same verse. When we have the oneness amongst ourselves, then Kulach Yafa Rayasi Umum Einbach. This is a verse from Shir Shirim. You're entirely beautiful, my beloved, and there's no blemish in you. Everybody's so perfect and united, God just sees us as being totally perfect and beautiful. This brings about the unity of the whole and blessed be He with the Shekhinah, the revelation of Or and Sof within the source of souls of the Jewish people, the unity of one with one. So God's oneness is united within the oneness that we have created. You have a whole and blessed be HaKadosh Baruch Hu with Shekhinah, which is the source of us, and the revelation of Or and Sof, God's infinite light within the source of the Jewish people. We have created now a perfect harmony system, perfect alignment system, so we get our beautiful blessings and flow, divine light. Going back to this verse of Tam Tial and Val Kecha, Hashem's relationship with all souls is Tam, complete and perfect. The radiance of Chachma Ilah, sublime Chachma, shines into all in dimension of the Shekhinah, as per Vafta Lecha Kamocha, without seeing any flaws in the Shekhinah, caused by the flaws of the Jewish people. So God is so perfect, we're the one to bring the flaws into the picture. But when we have unity, and God gets in on the unity situation, the same way self-love covers over the flaws, God, same thing. God, oh, I see no flaws, not because I don't acknowledge them, but because the self-love overrides it. And we saw God creates the barrier so that judgment doesn't come down. When he says, Tamim Tiam Im Havaya Elokecha, should be perfect with God, God in general, his relationship, it's a perfect relationship with the Jewish people, with the souls. And when you have everything the way it's supposed to, then Chachma is in, because everything comes from that, it shines in, all the light is shining in and flowing the way it's supposed to. Similarly, same that God has a perfect relationship with the souls, similarly, every Jew should be tamim with his fellow Jews, as in we should have a perfect unity with our fellow Jew. So that Havaya will be Elokecha. They usually translate it as God, your Lord. We know that's not the same. We know Havaya is one aspect of God's name, infinity, Elokecha, the name of Elokim. Will be Elokecha through offering the soul with complete self-sacrifice when saying Echad and Shema. It goes back to this a lot. When we say the Shema, the last word Shema Yisrael, Havaya Elokeinu, Havaya Echad, the God is one. And we did the whole Maamar about it. That was the first Maamar that we did of Kol Marach Be'echad. About when we say the word of one, we're recognizing God is the ultimate oneness within multiplicity of creation. The God is the oneness. God controls everything. God is intimately involved in every aspect of creation. We have to remember our job is here to make a home for God, etc. So when you say Echad in Shema, that's why it's the prayer of martyrs, because the testifying, it's attesting to the fact that God is the oneness of all of it. There aren't separate entities within the world, but there is only God as one. When a person says it, and thank God you don't have the sword on the neck, when you say it on a regular basis, you're supposed to say it with the intent of that I would totally sacrifice myself to attest to this oneness. We could truly do that when we have true completion, as in when we have true unity. Havaya refers to light that's Sodav Koloman. Remember, Sodav Koloman is the surrounding light. That's the higher light that can't be drawn in individually. It's a transcendent godliness above the worldly limitations. And Elokecha is the godly light that's B'mali Kol Omen. The life force of every individual divines worldly limitations. Remember, we even had from the last Maamar that B'mali, it's a light of definition because it's personalized to everything. So this is what it is. versus Sovet, because it's so great, it can't be individually drawn in. That's how you can have the world of flux. We want Havaya, that's indicative of this higher level of God's divine light, next to this level of divine light, that's a more personalized divine light. It's more limited just because of the fact that it's tailored to individual things. Our efforts in Ahavas Yisroel reveal that the infinite dimension of Havaya is our life force. Like we say in Shema, that what is the truth of us? The truth of us is infinity. That transcendent godliness associated with the name Havaya is the energy of Elokim, our life force. Remember, Shema Yisrael, listen up Jewish people, Havaya Elokeinu. What is our nature? Our true nature is Havaya, which is infinite. So when we talk about that, Tamim Tia Im Havaya Elokecha, you shall be perfect with Havaya Elokecha, you have to get to the point where you recognize and you know that your true life force is really Havaya infinity. Part of this process that we're having to get there is through the absolute unity. Because you can't have absolute unity when you're seeing division. You can't have absolute unity when you're recognizing the physical things that separate us. Only when we recognize things on the more spiritual soul level can we actually have the full absolute unity. Videch Perishu, this is why Hillel said the rest is commentary. Why is Ahavas Yisroel so fundamental and everything else is commentary? Because the purpose of every mitzvah is to unite the Holy and Blessed be He with the Shekhinah. The purpose of everything is to make this part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this higher level of God, unite with this level of God that manifests in the world, the Shekhinah, which is accomplished through Mesiras Nefesh and also Ahavas Yisroel. So the way that it's fully accomplished is when a person attests to the oneness of God and when a person has absolute love for other people. For the essential unity of sublime man, Zah, so the sixth attribute with the Shekhinah, these two parts aligning. Shekhinah is called the beauty of Yaakov. I remember we did that whole thing about all the beautiful people. The beauty of Yaakov depends upon revealing a genuine love for another until it's actual self-love. So when you can love someone to the point where you know that this is true self-love, that's how you know they've truly fulfilled this mandate. Every Jew is a reflection of godliness. So love of another is comparable to self-love, as both share the same godly essence. First, people are part of God, that we saw. Because Havaya's portion is his people, they're all part of God. This is accomplished through Ahavas Yisroel and all other mitzvahs, so like commentary explaining this unity. Ahavas Yisroel is the fundamental representation of this unity, of the perfect alignment of everything. All the other mitzvahs are commentaries on it because they have an individualized representation of this unity. But Ahavas Yisroel is an all-encompassing, underlying, fundamental means of enacting this unity of all the parts of everything, which is also part of truly understanding what our entire purpose of what the entire world is all about. Torah, mitzvahs, and everything is all about. So that's why Hillel says this is the most important of all of it. This encompasses it on the most fundamental level, and everything else is its own category coming out of that. Thus we see why Ahavas Yisroel is so important, and thus we see why Hillel phrased it like that, in the negative. What's hateful to you, as in, don't create disunity. You don't reject somebody else out of a baseless hatred, because the repercussions of that on a spiritual level are way higher than what we could even see down here on the physical world.